It's great to see you.
Contact, but contactless.
Exactly. It's hard to believe that it's so long since we've seen one another.
Well, I think at least Zoom fills that gap, doesn't it, for contact, but it's different not having the full contact. It must be very different for the World Physiotherapy executive as well to be meeting without that personal, informal contact. Is that a big thing you miss?
Yes, I think so. You and I would have, when we were president and vice president and worked together for so many years on the board, would have seen one another, 2 or 3 times a year for those face-to-face board meetings. And the board has not met face-to-face since November 2019, which is really, that's a long time ago. And it looks like realistically, we're not going to be meeting face-to-face until probably 2022. So that's a big loss.
It is, but it makes for a very different environment that people have to recognise, that you'll get to know each other by using the Zoom facilities and the informal chat, but it's not the physical meeting and greeting in person. And I guess we're all in the same boat, and that's the important thing that we have to remember, that it's not affecting a particular group and others are still free. We're all locked in.
Well, that's true. Exactly. That's important, to manage. And of course, time zones have always made it tricky. So when we're having very regular Zoom meetings to deal with the work of the board. But again, when you live, obviously, with you, it's the evening time. And for me now, it's the morning time in Doha. And so that does become quite tiring, I think, for people, especially if it's an early morning or a very late at the end of the day.
I think I always remember it as one of the biggest compromises people have to have, is to share a time with the board that's going to be the best for everybody. It may not be optimal, but it's the best. And there'll always be somebody at the end of the day, someone at the beginning of the day, and somebody in between. But it depends where people come from, of course, as to what the time zones are. But it is a good point to remember that there is a lot of compromise that has to be made to meet at times that are not necessarily the most convenient.
Exactly. And of course, we're having elections for the first time in the middle of the cycle. If you remember the decision that was made at the general meeting in May 2019.
So that's the big change with the new rules, isn't it?
That's right. So 3 of the board positions, I don't know if you remember, when there was all of the regional board members were elected, and then there was by random sort of draw, really, 3 board members.
3 for 2 years. Yes.
That's correct. Yes. 3 for 2 years. So that's the member of the board elected by the European region, the member of the board elected by the North America Caribbean region, and the member of the board elected by the South America region.
Yes. Right. I think it's an important step, though, in terms of continuity of flow, because that was always one of our biggest risks, that everybody could go at once and there would be no continuity. So the CEO would be left with a new board. So from a governance perspective, I think it does reduce the risk to introduce people over a cycle and ensure that there is always continuity.
Absolutely. And that was always a big anxiety that you had, and you brought it to the board so regularly, this idea that suddenly we could have an entirely new board, and that would just be, not good practice at all. I guess what's really challenging, of course, is that there's no regional meetings happening either, at which these elections might have taken place.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, so there will be some potential lack of momentum. I think we need to find WP needs to find ways to increase momentum and ensure that member organisations still recognise that the work is going on, that it's still really important, and one day there will be a chance to meet in person. But in the meantime, it's the getting used to Zoom.
That's right, exactly. And I think it's probably worth clarifying, isn't it, Margot, that any member of a member organisation is eligible to run for election to the board of World Physiotherapy. But as you well know, having come through, you know, the member organization, you were the regional chair, then you were a board member, then you became the vice president. It'd be really helpful, I think, to hear from you the types of skills that you feel are important for board members to be able to demonstrate.
I think one of the first things really would be that the board is the governance group, and the management is happening with the CEO and all of the other staff. And there's a very competent group of staff that are doing that. So it's always important to recognise the management versus governance. But from the governance perspective, I think it's also important to recognise that you are there to represent the world, not the region. And that can be confusing for people sometimes. So which hat do I have to wear? But even though people are elected by a region on the whole, it is to be a member of the board that works for the greater good for the whole world. And so that's the fundamental number one thing, I think. I think also people have to have an enthusiasm for knowing things about what's going on globally, rather than just bringing the knowledge they have from their own member organisation. And that's where those links with the World Health Organization and the World Health Professions Association are really useful, because you link with the other bodies and also recognise that we're having to look at global workforce and global opportunities for rehabilitation, and also equity of access to physiotherapy services. And some of those things are also key things that the board have to keep in mind as part of their role. So to me, it's recognising the governance and having an interest in what's going on in the world rather than what's going on in my little hub.
It's perfect. It's really beautifully encapsulated. You're right. I think it's one of those things that we've really become very conscious of, is that matter of conflict of interest and conflict of loyalty. So board members, in fact, almost all of the board members no longer sit on the Regional Executive Committee, which has really been a very big positive change, I think, because the regional executive committees are filled with, you know, very talented people, and that provides a great opportunity for regions. Mm. The other issue, of course, we have is that, you know, conflict of interest. If a board member is also in a leadership role in their member organisation, that has become an issue as well. So increasingly, we're obviously trying to make sure that, you know, board members have to manage these conflicts of interest. Right. So, you know, that has been a challenge.
To me, it's the next step up, isn't it? If you've had experience locally or regionally or nationally, then once you become the elected person on the World Physiotherapy Board, then that's your next step. So again, your own membership relationships with your MO become less relevant in terms of what you have to deal with for the greater good.
Absolutely. And Margot, one of the things that we always remarked about you, along with, you know, your immense talent and your incredible breadth of knowledge of the global community, was your work ethic. We always said we'd never be able to work as hard as Margot. But, you know, I guess that's one of the other things, right? It's having the time to be able to contribute to the work of the board.
Well, you know, I think, again, it's like anything else. If you agree to commit to something, then you must agree to commit time. And the more you put in, the more you get out. That's always been my philosophy. So you get engrossed in it, really, you get engaged in it, but you still have to recognise where your role sits in terms of management and governance. And again, you know, it certainly takes a few hours a week, I think, on average, to work on the work that you're responsible for. Quite a bit of reading, making decisions, making comments, all those sorts of things become part of what you do. But I've never really counted it in terms of hours, although, again, if you happen to be the person whose time zone fits for the middle of the day, that could be a little bit awkward in terms of your own job and your position. So you'd have to think about those sorts of things. But I think we all find ways to work around those things, but you do need to be committed and also be prepared to be proactive in terms of thinking of ideas, thinking of new ways, rather than just being reactive to what's happening.
Yeah, two great points. Actually, interestingly, in the information that we sent out, we said on average 5 hours a week. because that's
right.
what the guide within the UK for trustees of the charities.
Yes.
But actually, you know, that's probably what it is, not 5 hours every week, but on average, you know,
exactly.
over the course of a year. And so if people didn't have that time, then it's probably worth saying to yourself, you know, well, maybe this is not the right time for me to run for this, because I would say increasingly with Zoom meetings, because you can't have those 3-day face-to-face meetings, say, where you get a lot done, you're then having to break it up into chunks of time. So it becomes more frequent, but shorter.
Sure. So you're having shorter meetings, but more frequently, but you don't have the time difference in terms of getting from A to B. You know, traveling for a day and a half to get to a meeting becomes a commitment, which some people would really have to seriously think about in terms of whether they can afford to take annual leave or their employer's able to enable them to have leave. Again, it's something I think to think seriously about with your employer, to consider whether they would see being a member of the governance group of your international profession, whether that gives kudos to the employer. It could be that the university that you work for really appreciates things like that. It could be that your employer says, look, we've got so much COVID going on here that we can't afford to let anybody have time out of their employment. So it is something to perhaps have a discussion about with your employer, or if you're self-employed, consider it from an economic perspective and also from your professional association, because you would want them to give you support when you're putting your nomination forward. Exactly. It would be unusual not to have support from your own professional association. So some engagement with them and recognition of their support would be helpful.
Absolutely. So it's a requirement, obviously, that the member organisation supports your nomination to or your candidacy for election to the board. Interestingly, I think it's probably worth highlighting, Margot, because I think some people may not be clear that none of the board members of World Physiotherapy are paid for their roles. So all of the board members, as you remember, have a full-time day job, and that could be in private practice, or it could be in a different health setting, or it could be in a university, or it could be again in a policy role, in a ministry, or that sort of thing. So yes, definitely having that conversation with your employer, or if you are your own employer, thinking your way through that. The other thing, just I suppose to recognize, is that of course travel and accommodation and any expenses incurred in your role as a board member, when we all eventually get to travel and visit places, is covered. So those type of expenses are covered by World Physiotherapy. But that, unlike other perhaps non-executive roles on boards, there is no payment at this time, but there's capacity for it within the Constitution. But I think that's down the line.
But I think certainly the allowance that's given for travel and any real expenses, that they're certainly recognised, and so one's not out of pocket for things that are directly related to attendance at a meeting. But or if you have difficulty with having, I don't know, headphones or something like that to be able to engage in the Zoom meetings, then that could be a payment in lieu. But there's certainly no hourly rate for being actively involved in a board. just on that point, I think it is really important to recognise that the reward is much greater than some sort of in lieu payment, because the opportunities you have from being involved in the major decisions that the international group is making is such a big reward in itself, that I think anybody who's interested in an executive role would recognise that.
Absolutely, and it is an opportunity for great growth. So we are trying to manage that balance of being a very inclusive board with a board that needs to meet its legal and fiduciary responsibilities in the UK. So this year we started a bespoke finance training for the board members, which was really great, because some board members really felt they just needed to have more knowledge in that area. So it was great to get that organized, and of course all the board members committed to doing that. So I think it is that balance of recognizing that you have certain skills and experience and knowledge that you bring to the board, and that you're willing to develop the areas where you might not have had an opportunity to even have that knowledge or skill, which is important.
Yes, so I think that's a good point. You don't have to feel that you can be competent with everything when you first join, that there is the listening and the learning to be done, and the watching and observation, all those things we do as physiotherapists. And then you learn to put those together to perhaps be a more proactive board member. So I think there's a bit of physiotherapy assessment and management involved, even just being a board member.
Exactly. And of course, the issue then arises around language, and that has been a challenge because, of course, our operating language, legally within the United Kingdom is English. So what are your reflections about that, and how we've tried to manage that in the past, and I suppose the key challenges that raises for people?
I think it's important for people to feel that they can put their name forward because it is an international body and we need to demonstrate equity on the board in that way. But if I were not speaking in my native language, then I think it would be difficult to understand some of the more specific terminology. You may be fine in terms of the casual interaction, but when it comes to some of the more specific language of accountancy or even diplomacy, then I think it would be fair to offer people the opportunity for translation. And Google Translation's okay, but it's not as good as having a translator in place on a Skype or a Zoom meeting. So yes, at least initially, until people feel comfortable with the language.
Yeah. I think legally, the board member has to be able to be sure that they can sign off on the documents in English. Yes. I think that's an absolute requirement. And so if someone really feels that that's going to be too much of an ask, notwithstanding assistance, then I think that we have to recognize our legal responsibilities. What we have done, interestingly, is, of course, for some very technical documents, we now translate them into the first language of the board member.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that's helpful.
Excuse me. We do that. Mm-hmm. But of course, sometimes we don't have, sometimes we need a fairly immediate response. And you're right. Yes. Google Translate is great. If I'm preparing for a meeting, which is happening predominantly in French, I do a lot of Google Translate prep in advance because I wouldn't really be able to express myself well enough in French, even if I have an understanding of it. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to sort of think about clever technology ways about using, because with Zoom, of course, there are opportunities for translators. Right. Yes. I think what's interesting is when we do get back to face-to-face, the reality is that we couldn't have 5 simultaneous translators in the room if 5 board members did that. And I think that's what people forget.
Organization.
Exactly, which is, you think one person with the translator, well, sure, of course, that's fine. But what happens if 3 people need 3 different simultaneous translators? That becomes an enormous expense to the organization. And it means we just wouldn't have the money to spend on other much more grassroots member organization oriented projects. So it's a trade-off that we're working through, I think, as a global organization. And I don't know that we have the solutions yet.
And I think it's the same for any of the other health professional bodies as well, that they don't necessarily have the opportunity to provide simultaneous translation. But as you said, there's lots of new resources out there which are really good and virtually do it in real time. And there's other opportunities for people to potentially have translation in front of them as through the virtual world of speaking and that sort of thing. But I guess the other thing is that there would be, depending on who comprises the membership, that the group will determine what the best way is, whether you have a day's lag to make your decisions or something like that. So the compromises will happen depending on the makeup of the committee.
Exactly. And so at the moment, what we try and do is have all our papers in 2 weeks in advance of the board meeting, which gives everyone time to read them and digest them and ask questions. And we also now have started having discussion sessions in advance of the meeting where the board might make the decision. And again, that's just to give people time to formulate and think their way through before we come to the actual decision making about the policy or the decision. Now, that of course requires more meetings and more engagement, but it is that trade-off of trying to make sure that we get all of the board members on the same page before we make a decision.
But I think in that respect, you can have efficiencies as well, because people have the paper, they know when the next meeting is, so they can commit some of the time to working on it, considering it, reflecting, and then acting.
Exactly, absolutely, absolutely. Margot, I'm mindful of our time, and it's the end of the day for you and the start of the day for me. Have you, as someone who was on the board for many years, serving as a board member and also actually serving as a regional chair before you were a board member and then as the vice president, any advice you would have for someone who's thinking about putting their name forward as a member of the board?
I think if you have an interest in the global profession, in the potential to assist physiotherapy to become one of the most well-known ways of rehabilitation so that there's equity amongst all our population in terms of access to physiotherapy, then this is something that could be right for you, because you would have that opportunity to contribute to that global workforce through the governance group of World Physiotherapy and through those interconnections that you have with the member organisations. And I think the other thing we probably haven't mentioned, but there is an opportunity for a role on subcommittees as well. And so if people have particular interests or attributes, then they can be matched with the key subcommittees that the board would be having for the time being. They're not always ones that continue forever. But for example, if you have interest in finance and budget, then the finance committee might be right. Or if you're really knowledgeable and have an interest in developing programs at the entry level, then perhaps the accreditation committee. So there are groups like that that people can contribute to as well. It's not just the governance meetings per se. That's
right. That's a great point, actually, Margot. And you obviously chaired the membership committee so ably as well. So that's another standing committee of the board. So you're right. I hadn't really thought about that, because I don't actually chair any of those committees. So all I can do is chair the board. So, so thank you for reminding me of that.
The role is big enough. I don't expect that you would even have time to do that. But it is something that the board members can contribute to in other ways.
Absolutely.
And there's often standing committees that would be developed for a particular purpose over a particular time. So as the world evolves, we didn't know there was going to be the need to have so many resources to manage COVID-19 in this past year. But look what World Physiotherapy's done in terms of resources that are accessible to everybody. And that's one of the things that's been amazing in my time being involved internationally, is you don't wait for the envelope to arrive in the post weeks after it's been sent. It actually arrives exactly the same moment in everybody's mailbox.
Exactly. It does create much more connections. And I suppose, obviously, we've got that big event where we're going to all be connecting together. And I couldn't miss this opportunity to because I know this video is going to be going out to the global community to say, right behind me, Congress on the 9th to the 11th of April, which will be a really interesting, big difference for us, Margot, as a global community, to have our first global Congress. So I'm really excited about that. And I know that you're participating as well. So just great excitement about that.
Numbers look good. So you'll have to pan around rooms from time to time and see who's there, so that you pick up some of the faces.
Absolutely.
So good luck for that. I hope that it goes really well. I know
we're really excited. Yeah, we're really excited. It's been fantastic. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to seeing what the elections of the board bring forward. I think that's going to be really exciting. And of course, then the elections after that will be the ones that will take place in 2023 at the general meeting in Japan, where I hope we'll all be in a room together, seeing one another.
hopefully by then. Yes.
Exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
all the very best to you and to the executive, and good luck to the people who become the new executive members, and thanks to those who are retiring.
Thanks. Well, interestingly, of course, we must say that some of the board members may be seeking re-election and others may choose not to. So we have to wait and see, but thank you.
Right. Okay, nice to speak to you, Emma.
Thanks,
Bye.
Margot.